Back in the spring of 2012, something went, well, terribly wrong in the fields of Ontario, Canada. A silent, totally devastating event just unfolded, and it left beekeepers completely shocked and, an entire ecosystem hanging in the balance. So today, we're going to dive into the story of that crisis and the investigation to figure out what exactly was killing Ontario's bees.
It all started with observations just like this one from a beekeeper named Tibor Sabo. Can you imagine? You've spent all winter carefully tending to your hives, they look strong, they look healthy, and then, boom, they just start collapsing right in front of your eyes. This wasn't some slow, sad decline. Nope. This was abrupt. It was catastrophic. And here's the thing. Tibor Sabo was not alone. Not by a long shot. This was happening all over the place. Reports just started flooding in from more than 200 bee yards all across Ontario, and they were all describing the exact same thing, these mysterious, incredibly fast bee deaths. The scale of this problem? It was absolutely massive, and you can bet a quiet panic started to set in.
All right, so to really get a handle on what happened, we need to look at the patterns that started to emerge from all this chaos. Because once you put them together, they paint a very clear and honestly, a very grim picture.
The stories from other beekeepers, guys like Bill Ferguson and David Shute, were just eerily similar. They all said the same thing. Their hives had survived the winter perfectly. They were buzzing, full of life. And then, it felt like it happened overnight, this sudden, massive decline. They talked about these thick carpets of dead bees literally piling up in front of their hives. And on the inside, it was even worse. Queens were failing, the bees couldn't even build proper cells. A lot of them started to suspect the comb itself was somehow contaminated, because new colonies would just die or take off if they used comb from the dead-out hive.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. This is what the bees themselves told the investigators in a way. The symptoms, they weren't signs of disease or, starvation. The bees were seen twitching and trembling, totally disoriented. Their tongues were strangely extended, and this is the real kicker, many of them were found dead, still carrying pollen. That's huge. It means they were healthy, they were out working just moments before they died. And all of this, these are the classic textbook signs of acute pesticide poisoning.
So with all the evidence pointing towards a chemical culprit, the official investigation finally got underway, and it was led by Canada's top pesticide regulator. Let's take a look at how they tackled this big environmental mystery.
All right, so the agency in charge here was the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, or PMRA for short. Think of them as a division of Health Canada. Their whole job, their entire reason for being, is to review and register pesticides to make sure they're not going to cause unacceptable risks to people or the environment. So yeah, these are the people tasked with getting to the bottom of this.
And the PMRA, they treated these bee yards like full-on crime scenes. Their process was super methodical. They had inspectors go right to the affected sites. They collected samples of absolutely everything: dead bees, live bees, pollen, even the nearby vegetation. And then they did these detailed agricultural surveys, asking questions like, what crops are around here? How are you planting them? What was the weather like? They were gathering all the clues.
Now, right from the very start, the beekeepers had a prime suspect in mind. They were pointing the finger at a specific class of pesticide, one that had become incredibly common in modern farming.
That suspect, it was a neonicotinoid, and more specifically a compound called clothianidin. So what the heck is that? Well, it's a type of insecticide, but it's not the kind you spray all over a field. Instead, it's used to coat the seeds, in this situation corn seeds, before they even go in the ground. And here's the most important part. Everyone knows it is highly toxic to honeybees. That's not up for debate.
So this is where the leading theory really comes together. See, farmers use this special equipment called pneumatic planters, which basically use bursts of air to plant seeds. The theory was it was like a perfect storm. The spring of 2012 was unusually dry and windy, so these planters were essentially blasting this fine toxic dust right off the treated corn seeds and blowing it everywhere. It was getting into the air, settling on wildflowers, on dandelions, in puddles of water, and of course, directly onto the bees that were out foraging.
Okay, so we've got a clear suspect and a really plausible theory. The next step? The lab. All those samples that were collected from the field were about to be tested. All eyes were on the results because this is where the story was either going to fall apart or find its smoking gun.
The question was pretty simple, right? But the answer was going to be absolutely pivotal. Did the dead bees actually have the pesticide in them that everyone was suspecting? And here's the answer. The results from the lab were just stunningly clear. Get this. Of all the dead bee samples they tested, A staggering 70% of them contained clothinidin. That's the neonic from the corn seeds. Now let's compare that to the live bees from the same yards. Only 5% had any detectable levels. I mean, wow, that is not a coincidence. That is a seriously powerful correlation.
So, based on this mountain of evidence, the PMRA released its preliminary conclusion. Now, the language is, pretty cautious. It's what you'd expect from a government agency, but the message between the lines was crystal clear. They officially acknowledged that yes, the pesticides used on those treated corn seeds may have contributed to at least some of the bee deaths. For them, that's a pretty big statement.
So, there you have it. The link was established, the investigation had found its culprit. But what happens next? What happens after the verdict comes in? Well, that brings us to the all-important regulatory response.
And this is where it's really fascinating to put Canada's response into a broader context, because just 4 years earlier, back in 2008, Germany had an almost identical thing happen, a mass bee kill linked to clothinidin dust, and their response? It was swift and decisive. Within weeks, they suspended the registration for 8 different neonicotinoid products. Canada, on the other hand, took a different path. There was no outright ban. Instead, the PMRA focused on mitigation, basically trying to come up with better practices to stop this from happening again.
So what did those actions look like? Well, they proposed a few things. First, improving communication between the growers and the beekeepers, so at least the beekeepers would know when planting was happening. Second, changing the labels on the treated seed bags to add more warnings. They also wanted to work with the pesticide companies to improve the coatings so they're less dusty. And finally, they wanted to require new equipment, basically these deflectors for the air seeders, to push the dust down towards the ground instead of up into the air. And this brings us to a really, really crucial point. The only reason this whole investigation even happened was because beekeepers raised the alarm. The PMRA, as the regulator, absolutely relies on these incident reports from people on the ground. They need them to understand what's actually happening out in the real world. Without those reports, it's pretty likely this connection would have never been officially made.
So, for any beekeepers who might be watching, this is so important. This is how you can help. If you ever suspect a pesticide kill, you need to contact the PMRA or the manufacturer. Document everything you see, the symptoms, how many hives, the weather, any planting activity nearby. Snap photos to back up your report, and if you can, collect samples within 24 hours, pop them in the freezer immediately and keep them away from light. This preserves the evidence. Your data is absolutely vital.
Ultimately, the story of the 2012 bee kill leaves us with a really big, profound question. It just highlights this incredibly complex chain of responsibility, right? You've got the pesticide manufacturers, you've got the regulators who approve the chemicals, you've got the farmers who plant the seeds, and you've got the beekeepers who are basically the frontline guardians for these essential pollinators. It really makes you stop and think, when an entire ecosystem is at risk, where does the responsibility truly lie?